Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And today, it's Sunday, and normally on Sunday, it's the Sunday Penguin. But the Sunday Penguin I was going to do, I had last minute idea changes about it. So I'm putting it off because I'm going to be doing something completely different with the Sunday Penguin I was going to do. So I had to come up with something different to do last minute because it's Sunday right now and I need to put something up for Sunday. So I have to think of something to do and I decided I'd rip somebody off because when you don't have any ideas of your own, that's what you do. You just rip somebody off. And I decided to rip off CriminOlly. CriminOlly, the biggest villain on BookTube. If you're going to steal from somebody, steal from this guy. So every Sunday, CriminOlly has a segment called the Sunday Bollocks, where he will just talk about anything that strikes his fancy. I don't know what bollocks really means. It's some kind of British word. I should have Googled it. But whatever bollocks is, that's what he does, I guess. And so I'm going to do my own bollocks. I'm bollocksing right now. It's bollocks. So for my Sunday bollocks, my one and only Sunday bollocks, I decided to talk about book criticism and book critics. And ask the question, and possibly answer the question, do we really need book critics in today's world? A world with the internet where every single individual reader can leave reviews for other readers to read. Everybody can leave a review about a book. On Goodreads, you can leave reviews. People leave reviews all over the place on Goodreads. Amazon, people leave reviews. The BookTube here. All of us talk about books all the time and are leaving book reviews. Many of us actually get advanced reader copies of certain books so we can talk about these books before these books come out, so you can make a choice about whether you want to buy them before they even arrive, which is something that book reviewers have been doing forever. Professional book critics, I should say. So in this world that we're living in now, and in the world that's coming, is there a place for professional book critics? And are professional book critics even necessary? I don't know. Well, let's answer this question. So, in this world, wouldn't it be better as a reader to know what your fellow readers think about a book, as opposed to some snooty book critic who thinks they know it all? Especially since book critics are so often and have so often been completely wrong about certain writers. Now, I am only acquainted with one book critic, that would be Steve Donahue. And I've never actually had any kind of conversation with Steve Donahue about his job as a professional book critic. So I'm just giving you a completely uninformed conversation here, but he is the only person I know that actually does this for a living. And he's wrong all the time. So it makes you wonder, about this sort of thing. So let me just throw out 3 authors that book critics have been wrong about in the past. One author is H.P. Lovecraft. This is a Penguin Classics edition of H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft is one of the most important horror writers who has ever lived. His writing is tremendously influential. It will continue to be tremendously influential, I'm assuming. And critics have, by and large, over time, hated H.P. Lovecraft. They didn't like his style. Many still don't like his style. Many just don't like his work at all. And and H.P. Lovecraft is kind of an easy target, I think, because his style is so Baroque, and the way he writes, he's just an easy target for a book critic. But H.P. Lovecraft was the master of his style. He wrote the way he did quite deliberately to produce a certain effect in his writing. And it worked tremendously well. H.P. Lovecraft's writing did, which is why he is a classic writer. And all those critics who said he sucked, well, they were all wrong, obviously. H.P. Lovecraft has stood the test of time. He is a great writer. So the critics, by and large, were pretty wrong about this guy. What good are those guys? So another author I'm going to mention, I'm going to mention three here, is an author called Nelson Nye. This is Born to Trouble by Nelson Nye. Now, recently, this critic that I mentioned, Steve Donahue, read a couple Nelson Nye books, and he was just like, this guy sucks. So, to be fair to Steve Donahue, he did read two books that were towards the end of Nelson Nye's career. One of the books he read was one of the last books that Nelson Nye wrote. And Nelson Nye, all of his best work was written decades before the book Steve read. So yeah, the book Steve read probably really sucked. But one of the things that perplexed Steve was the language and the style of Nelson C. Nye. I will give you a little taste of it. Let's give you a dramatic reading. No one had to tell me shafts was booming. I had to duck between buildings 3 times in 5 minutes to let shouting riders have enough room to pass. Burrow Alley was a red light district, with painted-faced harridans beckoning and calling from the brothels that lined both flanks of the trail. One canary-haired harlot heaved the bouncers up out of her shift, bold as bullspit, and ran a wet tongue around the rim of her mouth. When I kept right on going, she flung such blasphemies after me, it's a wonder my ears didn't break into flame. Passing Jack Schwartz's saloon, I came on to the main drag. It was about as noisy a place as I had ever got into. Horses neighing, cattle bawling, galoots of every description and color shouting and swearing in 40 different lingos, and each one trying to out-yell all the rest of them. Through the thick pall of dust flung up by this traffic, I could see the gray shapes of the great rumbling ore wagons grinding their way through the clutter of buckboards. Horsebackers weaved in and out among buggies. One guy with a red dripping Arkansas toothpick made a dive through the crush with 3 other gents after him. I never did see where he got to, but all of a sudden, some hitched horse gave a screech and went up on his hind legs, with 5 others with him. The tie rail tore loose and came plumb off its uprights, and those terrified broncs in the backlash of panic slammed it into a storefront whose high wooden awning came down with a crash. So, what the hell was that? Okay, so Nelson Nye, in his description there of a young ranger entering this booming mining town, he wrote that in a particular way. He wrote that in prose very reminiscent of the old Western pulps. Nelson Nye began his career in the old Western pulps. And in the old Western pulps, there was a lot of that kind of description. A lot of that kind of prose. Now, even in the old Western pulps, a lot of pulp writers, Western pulp writers, were either breaking away from that kind of thing or never even indulging in it at all. Recognizing correctly that nobody ever talked like that. Ever, anywhere. That was a complete invention of the dime writers and the pulp writers. And a lot of Western pulp and adventure writers wanted to write in a more direct and realistic fashion. They took their work seriously enough that they wanted to do that. And going into the paperback era, while a lot of writers carried some of that with them, a lot of them abandoned that kind of thing entirely and moved on to a different style of writing. Nelson Nye leaned into that and developed it into kind of an art form. So that as a reader, when you picked up a Nelson Nye book, you kind of expected that kind of thing. And you would expect that kind of thing from certain writers. But Nelson Nye, he did kind of develop that kind of style of old pulpy writing into an art, so that when you picked up his book, you read it and you would appreciate it for that. His readers appreciated that kind of writing. And indeed, he was a very popular Western writer for a long time, back when the Westerns were popular. He won awards. He knew exactly what he was doing when he was writing those books. And I can imagine, as a book critic who reads everything, picking this up, which is a very particular kind of writing, you might just say, what the hell? What are you doing? He was doing something very specific for a very specific audience, and he was doing it pretty well, at least for a long time. He did lose it a bit in the 90s and the early 2000s when he was writing his final work. But for a long time, Nelson Nye was at the top of his game, and he knew exactly what he was doing when he was writing in that kind of style. This is another writer that has been unpopular with the critics. For a long time, many critics just hated this guy. In fact, there are particular critics, Steve Donahue among them, who still hate Stephen King, think Stephen King's terrible, don't like his writing style at all, think his dialogue is terrible, think he breaks all the rules of writing, and just can't stand him. However, this guy is enormously popular, Stephen King, and has been for decades. So as a reader, who are you going to listen to, right? If you're deciding who to read and you say, Stephen King, I've heard of this guy forever, should I read this guy's books? Everybody seems to like his books except for these particular book critics. And why should I listen to them anyway? Right? Why should you listen to them anyway? If book critics have been so spectacularly wrong in these cases, why should I listen to book critics at all? And is there a place for them now when I can get book reviews from so many other places? From people, well, heck, a lot more like me. Just, your average readers. Perhaps they are the ones you should listen to. Why listen to these snobby book critics anyway? What do they know? Well, first of all, it doesn't matter what anybody thinks about writers. If you like a writer, it doesn't matter whether that writer is unpopular or popular. It's okay to like any writer, except James Patterson. Don't like James Patterson. He sucks horribly. But any other writer in the world, except James Patterson, it's okay to like them, no matter what anybody else thinks. Book critics, however, are in a different position from the rest of us who are just writing reviews about books we like or talking about books that we like. Here on BookTube, for example, no matter how popular you are as a booktuber, your audience is going to be pretty narrow. a book critic has they have a really large audience. They have an international audience. Sometimes their audience is gigantic. And so as a book critic, you're not just writing or reviewing for one type of reader. You have to keep everybody in mind. Everybody who reads books, you've got to keep all of them in mind. And you're not just reading one type of book or one genre of book, typically. Usually, if you're a book critic, you're reading everything. All kinds of different types of books. And so when you're reviewing books, I would imagine you have to have a more broad audience in mind, and you have to have different parameters for the way you are reviewing a book. And I would imagine if you're a book critic, to even accomplish this, you would have to have certain ideas about what makes a good book and what makes a bad book. And you have to make that call because that is your responsibility. If you're a book critic and you're getting paid, and this is important, if you're getting paid to be a book critic, you have to make those calls. I was thinking about this the other day. I was watching a live stream video with Mike's book reviews, and there were a couple authors on there. And he asked, okay, what's the worst fantasy book you ever read? And Christopher Rocchio was on there, and he's like, I can't say that. I can't tell you that. I don't want to offend anybody. And Brian Lee Durfee was on there, and he's like, yeah, if I don't like a book, I don't even review it. Which is understandable, because they're both professional writers, and they're not in the position where they want to piss anybody off or offend anybody or hurt anybody's sales. And I think a lot of us are kind of like that, where if we just can't stand a book or think a book is bad or think a writer is bad, we might not really say. Maybe we will. A lot of us do. But a lot of us kind of feel like, maybe not. And we don't have to, because we could pretty much do whatever we want. And if you're writing a review for Goodreads, you could be literally anybody. You can have no knowledge of what makes a good or bad book. And you can just say, you could just say War and Peace is a piece of crap. This book is terrible. Why are there so many characters in this book anyway? This book doesn't make any sense. If there were this many characters in this book, there should at least be a dragon. There's no dragons in War and Peace. This book is crap. Anybody can write a review for Goodreads or Amazon. Anybody. And it can be total crap, and you have to keep that in mind when you're reading just anybody's reviews. They can be total crap. When you're going into any kind of book review, be skeptical. Always be skeptical. Right? If you're a book critic, you could be just as wrong as anybody else. But you have a responsibility to try to get it right, because you're being paid, which means you have to have a certain idea of what books are good, what's bad, and what's good in a book. And to the best of your ability, you've got to lay that out for your incredibly broad readership. So when a book comes out, you have to say whether it's good or bad. You can't, I'm just not, you have to say. I think that probably leads to certain book critics having very hard ideas about what is good and what is bad, and just not changing those opinions. So that if you have an opinion that Stephen King is a terrible writer because of the way he writes, you have to say so, and your opinion is going to be firm on that. Right? Because you know what a good book is. This is what you do. and you have a responsibility to do it to the best of your ability and to be honest about it. So if you think this guy is crap because of these reasons, you're going to say so, and you're going to stick to that opinion. And you could be wrong, right? But you got to try to get it right. With Stephen King, very often they're wrong. Because what's going on with Stephen King, he's a very particular kind of writer. An addictively entertaining writer, I have to say. But he does have his failings, which I can see would make a lot of book critics just crazy. His dialogue is sometimes pretty bad, although not as bad as a lot of book critics would have you believe. A lot of his books have just, there are things that could be way better. Stephen King is he's a whole thing. So, but he is, by and large, a good writer who's written some very, very good books. And to say that he hasn't, it's just wrong. But it's understandable why that happens. Book critics are important because book critics do have that broad view. They tend to have a broad view because they read everything. And they are professionals. They do have a responsibility, and they tend to take this responsibility very seriously. So, as a reader, that is very valuable. Even though they could be wrong, it's very valuable to have that separated from the amateurs. I am an amateur. I don't get paid for just yapping on about what I like, right? But I do not have the breadth of reading that somebody who reads everything does, or that is a professional. That's a different viewpoint, and it's important to have that. My worry is that book critics will become less valued because you can just get any old review from anybody and anywhere. And going into the future, that is a worry that I have. As a reader, book critics are important. They're a tool. They're a very important tool for helping us choose books. If you want to venture out of your genre that you read all the time, if you want to have a wider scope of reading, and there are new books coming out, or some books that you've heard of, it's good to have a view from a professional book critic, because their view is going to be an educated, informed view of that book, even if they are occasionally wrong. I think there will always be, and should always be, a place for professional criticism. That is a standard that should be maintained, because it is good for readers to have that. And that is my opinion of it. My opinion is that critics, even though they can and do get it wrong, they're very important. And my hope is that even in an age where anybody can give an opinion, and can and should, we have this small select group who can give a more broad, well-informed opinion about literature. I guess that's all the bollocks I'm going to sling today. I will catch you next time.